Hello, we continue our broadcasting from Kiev, and we are very happy that our guest today is James Sherr, Honorary Fellow of the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn. He also is an Associated Fellow and former head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. And it is very interesting story that Mr. Sherr is the only, I think, only one person who is still, just I think, still member of Valdai Club, and at the same moment, he is official sanctioned by the President administration of Russia. Mr. Sherr, hello, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello. Technically, I'm sanctioned by the Ruski MID, but это одинаковый. Okay, it's a pleasure to be back. Я рад с вами еще раз встретиться.
Мы тоже очень рады, James. James, we have our last conversation more than a year ago. And at the end of 2025, everyone finds themselves at a certain point: Ukraine, Europe, Trump, and Putin. And the main question is why we are where we are today.
So let us look at this at several levels. First, Donald Trump. And what I have to say about him, I am not saying for the first time. Let us pretend that Donald Trump has no moral faculties at all. Без моральных ценностей. Let's pretend that. It might or might not be true. But once you assume that, then almost everything he is doing and not doing makes perfect sense. Once you assume he neither has the cognitive nor emotional ability to see, recognize, and connect with the moral dimension of life, the ethical dimension of life, so much makes sense about him. Including, of course, the fact that he doesn't care about Ukraine at all. But then we need to add some things also. The first thing is absolutely complementary to this. It follows from this. He has a Darwinian view of the world. Might makes right. Big people have rights that little people do not have and should not have. Big people are worth talking to. Little people are nuisances. They get in the way. Even Zelensky's size is something that irritates Trump. The fact that he is in stature a relatively short fellow. Putin's not much taller, by the way. Putin and I think, are the same height. I'm not tall either. But anyhow, in this is very similar to Putin. The Russian view, it's not just Putin's view, is that a state is only sovereign if it is self-sufficient. In the Western view, sovereignty is an attribute of international law, and all recognized states are legally sovereign. It is a legal status. In Putin's mind, it is a political status, a factual status, and Trump is the same. So this explains why Trump has repeatedly accused Ukraine of either starting the war with Russia or being to blame for the war with Russia. Because in this whole schema, it's incumbent on small people to do what big people require. There was a famous Hollywood mafia film. I think it was Goodfellas. First scene began with a mafia guy driving up to a very handsome house in Hollywood, California, ringing the doorbell, saying, "Could I come in?" Telling the owner, "I love your house. You know what? I want to live here." "Well, you can't live here. This is my house." "But you don't understand. I love this house. I need to live here." And the fellow said no. Well, that was the end of him. He might not have said no. He might have recognized this. But you see, if a big guy takes over your house or your country or just 2, 3, 4 oblasts of your country, you have to accommodate. And if you don't, and the result is that he destroys your country, you're the one who is to blame for this. And Trump has repeatedly said when questioned, you see, Russia's a much bigger entity. Ukraine should not have done this. So this is the Darwinian view of the world that he has. And he doesn't understand arguments to the contrary because they're abstractions. He understands two things. He understands power and he understands money, which is also a form of power. He seeks to monetize, convert into monetary and financial form all relationships, all transactions. If someone is not interested in doing that, he has no interest in them, and he has no respect for them either. This is what he means when he says Ukraine has no cards. Ukraine has behaved more courageously than I think any country in Europe is capable of behaving. I might make an exception for the Baltic states and for Poland and for Finland if we are invaded. But Ukraine has fantastic technological ingenuity. Ukraine is fantastically creative. But in Trump's mind, we have no cards because we are neither rich, you are neither rich, nor are you powerful. Then you also have to add to this, there's a fourth factor I'm forgetting, but a third factor is he is very vengeful. He is come to power determined to seek vengeance, to seek revenge from his earlier opponents, who he believes deprived him of an election victory earlier, and who he hates anyway, because of everything he thinks they represent, all this permissiveness and so on and so forth. Putin is also full of hatred. The difference is that Putin has long, cool hatreds, and Trump's hatreds are very hot. And my perception is that the European leaders who have spent so much time trying to conciliate him, trying to get close to him, trying to flatter him, all this sickening stuff, they're doing it because they do perceive they're dealing with somebody and something that is not normal, certainly not in our civilization, that is very difficult to manage. There are people who believe that one must do all these things to prevent him from becoming totally insane, totally destructive. I'm not making this up. And the result of this is that it increases this desire to flatter him, conciliate him, prevent him from, in what we say in England, throwing a wobbly, having a temper tantrum. Doing what he did with Zelensky, where he takes the maps of demarcation lines and throws them across the room and says, I'm sick of listening to that. So you have to put all this together to understand what we're dealing with. And it was obvious a long time ago, and yet many people refuse to accept it. many people in the American establishment, particularly Republicans, and a lot of people in the European establishment, they treated him the way the German generals treated Hitler in the very early 1930s. They were very frightened by Hitler. They thought he was unbalanced. They did not share his beliefs, at least not many of them, but they didn't know what to do. And so they were in denial. They said, oh, it's not really going to be as bad as that. The broth is never eaten as hot as it is cooked. Okay? Right? And we can educate him, we can conciliate him, we can calm him down, all the rest. The establishments of the Western world have approached Trump in the same way, despite the fact that they could see again and again it doesn't work, or maybe it works for a couple of weeks. The only occasion in which Trump has stepped back from something he's been threatening to do is when people have stood up to him, not when they have flattered him. Even Europe at times has stood up to him, and he stepped back. After this disastrous summit with Putin in Alaska, and Trump again met with Zelensky, all the European leaders, suddenly, all the key ones, came together and supported him in the White House. And Trump knew he's facing something cohesive, and he has to be careful. The only reason I think Trump doesn't completely throw Ukraine overboard and accept Putin's terms for ending the war is that he knows that the political repercussions for him would be too dangerous. So he's trying to do a lot of this without going too far. So if you want to restrain Trump, you have to show strength. You have to show moral strength. Now, this gets to my second issue, which is Europe. This has become very difficult for Europe. For 80 years, we've been in a relationship of completely trusting interdependency with the United States in a number of areas, but most relevant for our purposes is defense and security. But it's always been an unbalanced interdependency, because the worry is that in so many critical areas, this interdependency simply amounts to dependency of Europe on the United States. And Ukraine feels this too. If the United States, again, does what it did before, if it cuts its support of intelligence to Ukraine and long-range communications, all these things, there is no one in Europe with an equivalent system who can just fill that vacuum. The British independent nuclear deterrent is dependent on the United States for missile guidance, telemetry, and other things. In extreme circumstances, first of all, the treaty we concluded with the United States back in 1962, the Nassau Agreement, is one where the United States acknowledged in extreme circumstances the UK would act alone without the backing of NATO in employing its nuclear weapons. But in practice, there's a lot of dependency. Everything is so connected. To imagine Europe assuming all of this itself is too big a proposition for most people. And they don't accept that nevertheless they have to find a way of doing it. That it is essential to our survival that we make plans and commit resources to gradually, progressively enhance our scope for autonomous action. Can't be done immediately. But, you know, if those who said in January 2025, we can't do that, keep saying it over 10 years, in 10 years' time, we will still be where we are. So some countries realize this, and we are gradually taking steps to enhance our own capacity to act autonomously in response to our own political will, whether the United States agrees or doesn't agree. But that's a slow process. Ukraine can't afford a slow process. Ukraine needs urgent and very robust assistance from partners it really trusts. It needs it now. And therefore, all these long-range plans don't do anything. The words themselves don't mean anything. The question in everyone's mind, including mine, is whether the EU, as we see over the whole Russia sanctions issue, has the moral capacity and psychological capacity to stand up against any determined opposition. We don't see it. Making speeches, setting up, even spending money, setting up programs, new institutions, that doesn't do it. You have to do it. When have we actually seen that? Now, this leads to Ukraine, but at two different levels. One is connected, one is separate. The part that is connected is that I think, my perception by now, is that Ukrainians very rationally, the vast majority of Ukrainians, for very rational reasons, in part for the reasons I mentioned, no longer trust their partners at all. The vast majority of Ukrainians understand our future depends on us. The security of Ukraine and military, in the military sense, depends on the armed forces of Ukraine. It doesn't depend on the United States, doesn't depend on Europe, because we can't count on them. I emphasize again, there are many impressive people in Europe who think in the same way. I won't mention a name, but one of the top 2 or 3 military officers in the British Army said, before Donald Trump was elected, he said, we have to plan for the next war on the assumption that the United States will not be there. We have quite a number of highly qualified people who understand that, who are as realistic enough to understand that. But even half of them will say, oh my God, but you mustn't say it. Why mustn't we say it? How are we going to get popular support for what we need to do if we're afraid of saying it? We have to look after ourselves, otherwise we will have less to look after, and we will be in a position of ever-increasing weakness and danger. How are we supposed to change that reality if we don't change perceptions? How do we change perceptions if we are not honest with our own people, with our neighbors, with our partners about the dangers we are actually facing? Well, the only people who I think have thoroughly understood this have been Ukrainians. They understand it perfectly. And they know, they have the confidence that whatever happens to the country, even if Russia destroys half of it and occupies half of it, the Ukraine will still exist. Ukraine will still be there in some form. I think this is, as demoralized as people are, I think people understand that. Now, then there's a second aspect of this. And it goes back a very long time, and it brings us to the issue of Russia. The The whole process by which Ukraine became an independent state was a process of both living with and escaping from very deep structural, personal, oligarchic connections with Russia. And as a result, Russia's patrimonial state, its whole system of patron-client relationships, had its not only its analog, but it was connected with and in part the author of similar networks of entrenched corruption by EU definitions in Ukraine. And this has been well understood. And the result is that Russian entities, Russian interests have long enjoyed the ability to penetrate Ukraine's economy and have a lot of privileged access, even though that's been much diminished. And therefore, people know that what we call corruption in Ukraine is for Russia a matter of strategic importance. And they have enormous knowledge. Now, let us look at recent events in this slide. We have had several episodes now where Trump and Putin appeared to have an agreement about what to do, and they put pressure on Zelensky. But Europe backed Zelensky very hard, and so then Trump stepped back. This happened several times. What is different about the most recent time? The most recent time coincided with this major corruption scandal in Ukraine, in the energy sector. This is a clue because it's been the energy sector where Russia has the most knowledge and it has its interests are the most penetrated. I don't think the timing of any of this is nothing coincidental here at all. The interests of the Derkach family, which continue in the energy sector. The fact, although it's not reported, it doesn't seem to be reported in the West, that Dmitriev, Putin's special envoy in dealing with this, he has also had business interests in Ukraine. He understands the situation very well. It's a separate subject. It's never referred to. Somebody would really have to show me ironclad proof that he does not have a background in the Russian Foreign Intelligence Services. Dmitriev. This fellow didn't suddenly materialize out of nowhere. He wasn't suddenly trusted by the Kremlin because he had good ideas. He's a product of the same system that Putin is, that Putin has. He is a product of that system. He works inside it. And then he appears at a certain moment. By design, not by coincidence. But Europeans were so shocked by the latest revelations that this time, when Zelensky came under pressure, they did not immediately close ranks and support him. There was a lot of hesitancy. And so Zelensky has been hesitant. He hasn't known quite what to do. And then add to this something we don't have time to discuss, Zelensky's own involvement in this. I mean, Yermak has been a real focus of attention. He's no longer there anymore. But so much of this discussion, genuinely or simply politely as a matter of courtesy, assumes that the president himself is an innocent party in all of these matters, that he doesn't know what kind of system Yermak and his deputies were running in Ukraine. Okay. Well, that is why all this has caused a lot of uneasiness in Europe and a certain lack of confidence. And this gave both Trump and Putin their moment. And what happens after that? The emergence of this 28-point peace plan, which anyone could see. Fortunately, we had some good journalists who noticed it, but I noticed it immediately. Had to be drafted in Russia because all the syntax is clumsy Russian syntax. I'm not saying Russian is a clumsy language. It's a magnificent language. But when you translate it literally into English, it's clunky and clumsy. And this was a plan drawn up in Moscow. And suddenly he had this moment. And this has now shifted the whole preoccupation from Ukraine's defense to how we have peace with Russia. And then Europe comes together with Ukraine and we succeed in eliminating certain things. But then what is still there is staggering. I mean, imagine, if you will, just think about this. It is now publicly accepted and stated in Europe that if Ukraine loses the war with Russia, if Russia is victorious, that Europe itself will be endangered and that Europe could face not the covert active measures and hybrid war measures we face now, but could face kinetic conflict, direct conflict with Russia in a relatively short period of time. We not only understand this, our governments officially say this much, and yet the same governments are willing to commit themselves to a peace plan that calls for the gradual removal of sanctions against Russia. How is this possible? How could two sides of one brain be so completely disconnected? When people like me talk about the weakness of leadership in Europe, this is what we mean. The failure to draw basic conclusions from the things we know perfectly well. This is a sign of real weakness, of moral weakness. Again, we could talk about all the exceptions and the fine things being done, and there are real things being done, fine. I'm not arguing against that. But this is the depth of the problem we have. I know perfectly well I could name a number of people, if they had been in positions of power or even key positions of influence, at the risk of sounding like Donald Trump myself, I'm reasonably confident if they had been in power in 2021, the war, we could have deterred the war. It wouldn't have happened in the first place. It wouldn't have, at least would have been postponed. And I would just say one little point about this. When Joseph Biden was elected in 2020, I was one of several people, there weren't many of us, who said he has to understand Putin is going to test him immediately. Mm-hmm. And this happened.
And this happened.
By the end of 2020, my Russian colleague Igor and I wrote, I think, is a critical paper about this. At the end of 2020, the Kremlin decided that the only way to solve its problems with Ukraine, which it had not been able to solve, is through war. But they didn't know then if war would be safe. And they spent 2021 trying to figure out that it would be safe. And this was the purpose of all their tests of Biden, to see how he would react when provoked, when deceived, when threatened, when defied. And I can tell you, I have no hesitation in saying Biden failed every one of those tests in 2021. I'm not talking about what happened later. Every one. And some of them I think he wasn't even aware of. Now, if you had people in the United States and elsewhere in Europe who understands the operational code of this still in mentality Leninist Russia and how they do these things, how they prepare the ground for war, then there would have been answers there would have been different responses to every one of these tests, and they wouldn't have been dangerous. But Putin would have understood, I'm dealing with people who are really serious. We were at the time interested in trying to create the basis of a better relationship with Russia. Putin was not interested in a good relationship with Russia. He's not even interested in a good relationship with Trump.
Do you think he is not interested?
No, he's not interested in Trump's idea of good relations. Trump thinks, I'm going to offer him all this investment, all these joint ventures, all these other things. He could be in partnership with us. Well, Putin would be very happy to put all this in his pocket. Mm-hmm. But his real priorities are elsewhere, and Trump is not going to be able to change that. And Trump himself doesn't understand that. But Biden didn't understand it. The Russians didn't want good relations. They wanted changes. They were very clear about the changes they wanted. And so they had two questions in 2021 they were trying to get an answer to. Will the West talk to us on our basis? Talk according to our agenda about what we believe is important? Or if they're not willing to do that, are they ready to stop us? And by the end of 2021, they concluded absolutely correctly that the answer to both questions was no. And so we had the war. We have become so muddled in our own mind during this war, the West generally, that every defensive action taken in response to Russia, as it continues to expand the scale of what it's doing, the depth of what it's doing, the brutality of what it's doing, every reasonable defensive response is portrayed not only by the Kremlin, but portrayed by ourselves as a form of escalation. Our minds have been so confused that we now confuse defense with escalation. Mm-hmm. I've already heard it said, not by anyone in the Baltic states, but I've heard it said in the United States and elsewhere, if the Russians launch a small-scale attack against Narva, against Latvala, across the Belarusian border somewhere, well, we have to be very careful because we have to avoid escalation. No, we're not the ones escalating. We're defending our homeland. Mm-hmm. And the same is true of you. How have we got to a stage where we're unable to understand these simple things? Mm-hmm. We no longer have a political elite and a political class in the West that understands all the things that people learned during the Cold War. It's been bred out of us. I am sorry to indulge my habit for metaphors. I was told a long time ago a story about chickens who had on farms, that chickens who had been raised on what are called battery farms, where they are mechanically, they're machines that enable them, that make them have eggs at certain intervals, that when they're removed from these machines, they no longer have the capacity to lay eggs. I see that happening here, that we no longer have the capacity to lay our own eggs.
Great, yeah.
I see us also not drawing conclusions from what we know. A baby who sticks his hand in a pot of boiling water immediately draws conclusions and doesn't do it again. But what happens if you have a good education in the West? You learn that every pot of boiling water is different. Everyone should be looked at on its own merits, without prejudices and preconceptions. And that's the way we've been behaving. Again, not all of us, but far too many. Ukraine is immune from all of this. But Ukraine is facing danger of defeat and destruction. And what I see happening, and I'm impressed by it, and again, it's going to come as a surprise to the West, is the following: that Ukraine is beginning to do things in its own defense that it has not consulted its partners about, and that its partners don't approve of, and it will do them anyway, because pleasing us is no longer Ukraine's principal national interest. Ukraine's sole interest is saving Ukraine. And a lot of us will be cheering. You saw just, I think, yesterday there was a story that presumably Ukrainian forces, special forces or some other forces, attacked, seriously damaged a Russian tanker, not in the Black Sea this time, in the Mediterranean.
Mediterranean, yes.
I have not seen all the reaction, but I will bet there will be a large chorus of people in the West saying this is a dangerous escalation of the conflict. Anyway, I will stop talking now.
No, it was so interesting. Why? Why, James? Why?
Any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I have so many questions.
No,
First of all,
because we can't stay here forever.
James, you say that about priority of Putin. Where is the priority of Putin in that war, in that situation?
I said in 2015, and I've repeated it 1,000 times, Putin is determined to either subordinate Ukraine or destroy it. That is his priority. That's what he wants. And even if you can get him to sign a peace agreement on some other basis, this will just for him be a peridishka. This will just be a brief interval. And he doesn't really fully deny this. You see, the Russians demand X, Y, and Z. But then much later, in different channels, they say, no, это не всё. And they go back to the terms they already mapped out in 2021. We have to address the root causes of the conflict, meaning the presence of NATO forces in the сопредельный region of Russia, Baltic states, Poland, everything since 1997. So these are root causes of the war. The constitutional order of Ukraine is a root cause of the war because it is not constructed on a Russian basis. It's constructed on a basis that is that responds to Ukraine's own needs, that reflects its own history, but also reflects its aspirations to be part of Europe and the Euro-Atlantic system. And this is the basis of the Ukrainian political system. And for Russia, this is предательство. Russia is determined that Ukraine be returned to Ruski Mir. And they decide they cannot do this without conquest. And the sort of conquest that they understand, which is the conquest of the, what's the word in Russian? Mongolskaya Orda. Okay. This kind of conquest. You know, I mean, you probably do because you're sitting there and I'm sitting here. In Bucha, there was the Russian forces wrote on the walls, "Как вы смеете жить так?" And this was rather bewildering to a lot of people. And then someone explained it to me one day, the Ukrainian, explained it in perfect sense. What they meant was, you Ukrainians have betrayed us and yourselves, because Russians, proper Russians, what they are interested in is velichia. But you are only interested in comfort. And that means you have betrayed your korni, your roots. And that's why we are fighting you. Okay. So Putin means it when he sees this as a civilizational struggle. And he wants to rebalance Europe. And he said more than once, I mean, the ominous turn of phrase, which is events, which I have not seen many people notice, is that he used to say, we're not going to talk with illegitimate people like Zelensky. We will talk with a proper Ukrainian government. Okay? Not with these illegitimate people. But now he started saying, we don't have to deal with Europe. We will deal with their successors. We will deal with the people who come after the current government of Europe. He's confident enough that they have invested so heavily and so successfully in the fragmentation and the demoralization of Europe that they've weakened these governments to the point where you don't have to take them seriously, even when they're being serious. Everyone knows Friedrich Merz is very serious, very impressive fellow. He's being very serious. But you don't have to take him seriously, because not only are our views strongly represented in the opposition parties, but they are also more covertly represented amongst his own coalition partners in Germany. And they've invested in all these things. This is not accidental that these things happen. I'm not saying that, Russia is the only or even main reason why we have the problems we have. I come back to what an old friend of mine said. He used to be zam residenta of Japonia. He said, look for your vulnerabilities, and there you will find the KGB.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. His priority is to completely reincorporate Ukraine or destroy it. And to fragment and weaken Europe to the point where it is not capable of defending itself. And I just think in the most elementary terms. If some feeble, weak, and infirm peace is concluded with Russia, what do you think is going to happen? Millions more people will leave Ukraine. Lots of people will leave. Far more than we saw in February 2022. Because they will say, it's lost. I can't stay there. I can't subject my children to Russian domination or to their people or anything like that. Will Europe be able to cope without refugee influx? No. So who will benefit from that? The extreme populist right will benefit from that. Even in countries which today are very solid, this populist right will benefit. It's already been happening. I mean, it's happening in more places than I care to think about or talk about. They know this. They also know victory is not the end of something. It's a process. It goes on. It continues. This is, we're dealing with here with Russia. Воюющее государство. И воюющий народ. That's what you are dealing with. And yet we have people in Europe who, again, on the one hand, one side of their brain is shocked by their behavior and feels a danger and knows we have to respond. But on the other hand, is acting as if even after the most flimsy so-called peace, things will now get better. We could talk about some kind of normalization. We can restore trading links. They will be less angry. The left hand of the brain doesn't know what the right hand of the brain is doing and thinking. This is our crisis. It's not your crisis. This is our crisis. Very few people are willing to admit that, to state that.
James, I have the last one, but most James, I have the last one, but most complicated maybe question.
Well,
take into account, what you tell right now. What do you think we need to do with this war? I mean, Ukrainians. Because, for example, if you look for Trump, it is quite understandable what he wants. He just wants to stop the war. And truly speaking, if you take to account everything you tell right now, it looks like a best decision just to stop the war. But if you look for our partner from Europe, what are their strategy? Just to have war in Ukraine, and it is impossible for Ukraine to have war permanently, year by year.
Europe doesn't have a strategy. It has some very good and strong principles. It has now produced a number of good and strong policies and initiatives, but this is not a strategy. And when we talk about Europe having these things, we have to bear in mind that a large number of members of the EU, a minority, but not an insignificant minority, dissent from one or another aspect of this. So we have dedicated opponents to our policies in their very essence. We have a couple of dedicated opponents, Hungary being the principal one. Fico in Slovakia sounds like one. He's probably more opportunistic than that, but it doesn't matter. But then there are conditional allies. Italy is with us on some issues, but not on others. Spain also on some, but not on others. So and there's another issue, and it represents a real change, and we have to think through this. Over the years, I mean, since NATO's foundation, since the EU's foundation, since the Treaty of Rome, since the Washington Treaty of NATO, the greatest pillar of our own strength has been consensus. So both the NATO and the EU operate on the basis of consensus, which is a polite way of saying they operate on the basis of veto. Any member can veto what the others wish to do. This has been one of the major issues over unfreezing Russian assets, financial assets in the West. Okay. Anyone with eyes can now see that consensus has become the greatest weakness of both NATO and the EU. This is why there's increasing discussion about coalitions of the willing, about giving particular groupings inside NATO and the EU more of the substance of real power so they can do things on their own. To some extent, I mean, this has been happening. I mean, it's well understood here in Estonia, and Ukrainians should understand it, that our policy, if we are attacked in any way, is to immediately fight. And as our most senior people have put it, in Brussels they could be talking, in Washington they could be talking, we are fighting. The British commander of Cabrit, the British contingent here, has said about this, I am a subordinate to the commander of the Estonian division. If he gives me an order, I'll carry it out. London does not object to that. In Latvia a few years ago, I was told that the commanding general of the Canadian forces was told in Ottawa, don't even ask us what to do because we'll give you the wrong answer. You just, if you're attacked, you fight back. Okay. But at a certain point, you need reinforcements, you need enablers, and so on. We are assuming here, and we might be right, that if we respond decisively and immediately to anything they do, and country, and of course, in this case, the Russians will find they're up against something stronger than they first believed. And I didn't even mention the Finnish element to all this in this equation, that in Brussels they will realize we have to move quickly to support our allies. Otherwise, that's the end of everything. Yes, and that, I hope that's right. But we need to be in a better place than this. We need to be far better positioned than this. If a war should start, I could tell you that in the Baltic Sea, so many of the advantages Russia has in peacetime will become liabilities in war. Kaliningrad Oblast and the spaces there are very vulnerable. The Gulf of Finland can be easily blockaded, and I am convinced that if a war were to begin, it would be blockaded by Finland and by Estonia. And I think Sweden would join in. And what would the Russians do about it? Their options become limited. So, going back to what we said earlier, we have a lot of cards. But we have to show that we know we have them, and we have to play them, and we have to start playing now. And again, if you want to look at a counterexample of idiocy, a Finnish court, and I stress it was a court, so it is unlike the Russian system and unlike what I think people still rightly take for granted in Ukraine, court is not in any way subordinate, subservient to the elected government. It's independent. Finnish court, with regard to a ship in Finnish custody that had cut cables in the Baltic, and this is now proved that the ship had done this, that Finland did not have the jurisdiction to prosecute these owners because this happened outside Finnish and international waters and outside territorial waters. Now, this is madness. This is form of, if this is legal thinking, then the law has become a madness. This is like saying that if your car is vandalized and set on fire in the middle of Maidan Niezależności, nothing could be done because it didn't happen on your property. It's only if it was on your property, then you could prosecute. But no, if it's somewhere else, well, you have no jurisdiction to deal with. And one last point, because it's another major point. In the whole Western tradition, peace and war are antithetical entities. There is either peace or there is war. Mm-hmm. And it's true of our legal system. You either have legal system operates in peace, and in war, certain things are suspended and certain emergency powers exist. This is understood when Ukrainians talk about военное положение. Correct? In the Russian mindset, which I stress again is largely still this strategic when it comes to anything to do with defense and security, largely still a Leninist mindset, peace and war are overlapping. Mm-hmm. They are interconnected. And when they are operating in this terrain, which Lenin described as neither peace nor war, mm-hmm. they have maximum flexibility. But we are handicapped because we are handicapped by a peacetime legal culture. meaning you could know perfectly well and even demonstrate perfectly well that only the Russians could have done X, Y, and Z. But still, if you cannot firmly prove it, then you don't have conclusive attribution and you are not allowed to act. We have to, there's very little discussion in the West about the need to have a comprehensive reimagining of our legal system in these particular respects. Because at present, people are expecting we have to adhere to New York Bar Association standards of attribution before we do certain things that are vital to our survival. We can't continue to function like that. Okay. If there's a rule, if there's a policy that no aircraft, manned or unmanned, can overfly without permission. Military sites and other urgent sites, of sensitive sites, then you shoot them down. But the problem is in our legal system, there are all kinds of impedimenta. We have to confront this. Again, you do not suffer from this issue, but we do. So I'm sorry, I failed to answer your question, what Ukraine should do. First, certain things that Ukraine mustn't do. Zelensky recently made a major error. And it's the first time I saw him commit a major mistake. He declared, and I don't know the status of this declaration at this point, that Ukraine will renounce its aspiration to join NATO. This is a major mistake. Because there might be many reasons, but the reason I say major is because when you are dealing with Russia, and the same applies if you're dealing with Trump, it doesn't matter how many conditions you attach to a concession, and the attached conditions. We need proper security guarantees, we need this and that. And, with all that, we will renounce our aspirations to join NATO. The conditions don't matter. You've made the concession, you can't take it back. They won't let you take it back. From a tactical and strategic point of view and a political point of view, it is a terrible mistake. First, because it doesn't matter how many conditions you have. Once you make a concession, you will never be allowed by Putin or by Trump to forget it, and you won't be able to remove it. But there's a second reason. If Ukrainians agree this war is being fought to preserve the attributes of sovereignty and independence in Ukraine, then how can you possibly have such an agreement with Russia? This must remain, and the immediate response of Ukraine's European partners was the same. This must remain purely a matter to be addressed between Ukraine and NATO. It's not Russia's business. Once you concede over such a major principle that has constitutional standing, that we will renounce it, then what stops you from renouncing everything else? Ukraine mustn't cross this line. This was a major miscalculation on his part. Okay?
James,
He
thank you.
won't thank me for saying that, but there we are. Okay.
James, thank you so much for being with us today. And so sorry that it takes more time than you expect, but
No,
nevertheless,
it's
it was so interesting. Yeah, thank you so much.